the U.S. image abroad, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. In recent years, international polling data suggest that the U.S. image abroad has suffered a precipitous decline. Widespread support following the September 11th attacks has evaporated, and majorities in many nations view America as a threat. Has U.S. standing in the world become collateral damage in the war on terror? To help us understand how others see us and what the next president might do about it, we're joined by Stephen Kull, Director of the Program on International Policy Attitudes at the University of Maryland. Dr. Kull's articles regularly appear in publications such as Foreign Policy, Harper's, and The Washington Post. A frequent guest in the U.S. and international media, he also provides briefings for the U.S. Congress, the State Department, NATO, the UN, and the EC. Stephen Kull, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Stephen, I wonder if we could start by getting a sense of what is the problem? I mean, you hear a lot of anecdotal evidence. You hear people saying, oh, you know, it's not that bad. What are you finding in the polling research that you're doing?
Well, it is that bad in the sense that we're looking at something that's really quite new. It's not that people are simply jealous of the United States because it's so powerful. Because in the late 90s, for example, the views of the U.S. were really quite positive, and there has been no time in history where we have found these kinds of low numbers.
How far back does the polling on international attitudes, whether it's yours or others, go that we can kind of use as a benchmark?
Well, it's patchy. The further you go back, the patchier it gets, and because there just wasn't that polling capability, and it's only been in the last 10 years or so we can really look at the world as a whole. And as I say,
but even in that baseline.
Yes. But even going back further, there's just we have data from Europe going back further. You just don't find ever a time where there's this level of negativity. So something specific is happening here. It's not just jealousy or envy or something intrinsic to the nature of having such a big, powerful country in the world.
So what are the aspects of that negativity? I mean, how do people express that, or in what ways do they express that?
Well, the core of it seems to be a feeling that the U.S. isn't living up to the principles that it has tried to promote in the world. Now, in a way, that's a kind of a backhanded compliment. When you say that somebody's being hypocritical, you're implicitly saying if they were doing what they said they were doing, that would be something good. And in the post-World War II period, the U.S. did have a lot of positive image associated with it because it tried to promote a system of international law that would constrain the United States as well as other countries, promote democracy, promote a strong United Nations, promote human rights. But the theme was that the U.S. was going to be limited, just as other countries were going to be limited. And now there's a perception that the U.S. is departing from that the U.S. is a free agent, that it's unpredictable, that you don't know what it's going to do, and the U.S. is very powerful. Now, that is why people were so upset about the Iraq War. It's not that they didn't like Saddam Hussein, or they liked Saddam Hussein, or they didn't like to see him go. It's that the U.S. went ahead without UN approval in a way that was perceived as in violation of the rules. And that leaves people asking, gee, what's next?
I just take one step back. When we say people here, how extensive is the polling? How many countries are we talking about? How diverse is the set of countries that you're looking at?
Right. Well, there are different polls that we're talking about. In one poll that we did about a year ago for BBC, there were 26 countries, and in 20 out of the 26, they said that they saw the U.S. as having a predominantly negative influence in the world. There were some exceptions in Kenya, Nigeria, the Philippines, Poland, but for the most part, that was the dominant view.
So these are countries really from around the world?
All over the world, in every region of the world, and there have been some that have been done by Pew that get as many as 44 countries. So it's this is really quite comprehensive. What we're talking about here is clearly the majority of people in the world that are being polled here.
And so one big aspect was viewing at more negative than positive perception of the United States. What are some of the other questions that you asked that you're getting data on?
Well, we did ask for BBC, went through a series, and we have a graph here that shows that. What we found was that a clear majority in every country, this is an average across 26 countries, I should say, 75% disapproved of the way the U.S. been handling the war in Iraq. 69% disapproved of the treatment of Guantanamo detainees. 68% disapproved of the way the U.S. is handling the Israeli-Hezbollah war. And majorities also disapproved of the way the U.S. is handling Iran's nuclear program, global warming, North Korea's nuclear program, and so on. So it's in a sense generalized, but there's a kind of underlying theme here that the U.S. is too uncooperative, that it isn't working together with other countries, that it's asserting its will, that it's playing the role of world policeman more than it should be. That was a question that we asked in a worldpublicopinion.org poll and around the world, and majorities all around the world affirm this perception of the U.S. as playing the role of world policeman.
So if we have, on the one hand, we have respect for international law and compliance with international law being a value the U.S. has championed or is known for championing, but then being seen as violating perhaps some of these policy issues like treatment of detainees, et cetera, and asserting itself or not cooperating. Which again, the United States being behind the UN might be seen as being to value the U.S. as champion. Are there other values of that order that people feel, hey, the United States says one thing and does another?
Right. Well, the theme of human rights, of course, is key, and the treatment of terrorism suspects at Guantanamo and elsewhere. It's another example, in a sense, of a value that the U.S. has promoted, that the U.S. is perceived as not living up to. Another aspect is that the U.S. In that post-war World War II period was perceived as trying to help the poor, trying through the Marshall Plan and by making its markets more open to the goods from other countries. But now there's a perception that the U.S. is pursuing its self-interest, even at the expense of the poor, and that the net effect of U.S. policies is that it's hurtful to the poor, that it's making the gap between rich and poor worse.
It's also sort of anecdotally, you hear a lot, people don't like the U.S. government, but they like the American people. Is there still that dichotomy? Do people see those two aspects differently? Yeah,
there's still a distinction. Actually, if you just ask, how do you feel about the United States, warm or cold, people are still more on the warm side. And if you ask about the people, many express warm feelings, certainly warmer than they feel toward the United States foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy or the U.S. government is the thing that they have the most trouble with. Now, there's some bleed over. I mean, they do see the U.S. public in some way responsible because they elected these people and so on, but still there's some warmth there. And the American culture, there's still a lot of respect for American science and technology and so on. So there's underneath here a kind of a residual, some goodwill that's not gone, and people are still looking to the U.S. to show indications that they're ready to get back on the program that people generally actually like.
We mentioned in the opening of majorities seeing the U.S. as a threat. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's somewhat surprising, and this isn't a question that's been asked in all countries, but a fair number. And it's quite striking how many countries actually perceive the United States as a military threat. We're talking about allies like Turkey or Kuwait that we have defended in the past. There's really a perception that the U.S. is so powerful military that people think that, gee, we could be next, and we feel pressure from the U.S. to do what it says, because implicitly the U.S. could use military force against it, and as we've seen from Iraq, now they're not constrained by the international rules of the game, and so everybody's quite nervous.
I suppose someone could say, well, they might not like us, but they don't like anybody. So how are we, if we look at the relative rankings when you get this data back, how is the U.S. placed in either favorability ratings or threat ratings?
Yeah, well, in the BBC poll, we asked about 12 different countries, and the U.S. was down at the bottom, down in a category together with Israel, Iran, and North Korea. We were down there in the cellar. But other countries like Japan, France, the European Union, and so on, Canada, they're quite a bit more positive, and also quite significant when we asked would they like to see the European Union become more powerful than the United States, have more influence in world affairs than the United States. Majorities around the world favored that idea. We also asked about the possibility that China would catch up with the U.S. economically, and many people around the world think that that is going to happen in 20 years or so. And then we asked, well, if that does happen, how would you feel about that? And it wasn't they were overwhelmingly positive or negative. They said, well, you know, some positive, some negative, and you know, it was overall balanced, but it was certainly not a negative. What we're seeing overall, this negative feeling toward the U.S. is making people look more kindly on the European Union, look more kindly on China. So it's having a real effect on geostrategic dynamics.
We have about a minute or so for the break, and I wonder if we could stick with China for a second. And so the U.S. might say, well, if you look at Darfur, what China's doing there, or China's doing with the support of the Sudanese government, that China certainly is not faring any better than we are. So what does the data say?
They are faring better. They're not necessarily faring well in that list that I was mentioned of the 12 countries. They're kind of in the middle, little to the lower side. People feel good about China growing economically. They don't feel good about China growing militarily. So it's not that they want China to become another military superpower to balance the United States or something like that. There are concerns about China's human rights record. So it's a mixed view. But it used to be that the U.S. was more popular and was seen more as a model, and that's changed.
So some of the argument that they just resent us because we're powerful is debunked a little bit by the fact that you see this change, right? Because we've been powerful for a long time and not been this unpopular. We're just about at our break. We'll come back in just a few moments here on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking with Dr. Stephen Kull of the Program on International Policy Attitudes at the University of Maryland about the U.S. image abroad. And we do want to get into why do we care and what do we do about it. But Stephen, I wonder if there's a few more things I want to talk about in terms of the nature of world opinion. Another key segment is how the U.S. is perceived in the Muslim world. It's taken on obviously huge importance in the last 8 years. What are you finding there in terms of attitudes in Muslim countries toward the United States?
Well, something that we're finding that is really disturbing is that we may feel that what we're trying to do in that region is fight terrorism. That's what's in our crosshairs. It's a war on terrorism. But what we're finding is that people there feel that Islam is in the crosshairs, that the U.S. is actually out to undermine Islam itself. And we're talking 8 and 10 in those parts of the world. That's a real problem because that makes people very uncomfortable with the U.S. foreign policy. It makes it much harder for them to cooperate. A majority even believe that the U.S. is trying to spread Christianity in the region. Many in focus groups that have done there keep bringing up the fact that President Bush used the term crusade to describe what we're doing, and that has very much stuck in people's minds. I'm not saying that was the single cause of it, but that's the theme that people have. They don't necessarily like Al-Qaeda, but because the U.S. is seen as, in a sense, trying to harm Islam, it makes them less prone to oppose Al-Qaeda.
Well, the U.S. and the Bush administration, particularly when Karen Hughes was in as the head of public diplomacy and trying to work on improving the U.S. image, and the administration's put a lot of emphasis on spreading democracy in the Muslim world. Which has that countered this anti-Muslim sentiment?
Not really. There's a lot of unease about what that means when the U.S. is trying to do it. Now, there's also some negative feeling toward the U.S. for backing governments that are unpopular, like in Egypt and right now Pakistan. So but there isn't really a perception that when the U.S. tries to promote democracy, that it's doing so in a way that's independent of its interests. So they're quite worried. Now that doesn't mean that democracy isn't popular. It is. It's very popular in Muslim countries, and they don't see that it's contradictory with Islam. They think that it's quite compatible.
And is the root of the feeling that the U.S. is anti-Islamic derived from the U.S. military presence in the region? Is that the driving issue, or is it broader than that?
It's hard to say what the causes of that are. I mean, there is the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and there's a bewilderment that the U.S. is perceived as backing Israel and not backing the Palestinians, and there's a strong sense of identification with the Palestinians and feeling, in a sense, victimized by that. And that to them has very strong religious overtones. So that it has been in play for some time, but in the post 9/11 period, the perception is that America is very angry, vengeful, and that it sees Islam as the source of the threat. And they insist, of course, that it's not, and that they insist that they do not support terrorism, they do not support attacks on civilians, and in fact, polls do very much show that.
I want to talk some about, so why should we care? There may be some who say, hey, people aren't going to like us. We're powerful. We have to do what we have to do, and we will serve our interests. And people like it, fine. If they don't, fine. Why do we need to care about this?
Well, coercing people to do things you want is hard and expensive. It works much better if they cooperate with you, if they do it gladly. If the people in a country are hostile toward the U.S. and don't want to work with the U.S., don't want to go along with the U.S., it's hard for their government to do it, even if the government wants to do it. So there is definitely a political cost. This isn't mysterious. President Bush is not particularly interested in polls, he says, of the American public, but we know that he is interested in polls elsewhere. He assigned one of his closest advisors, Karen Hughes, to address this problem, of the problem of America's image in the world, to work on public diplomacy and so on. So there really is no mystery. There are also indications that when people get hostile toward the U.S., they stop buying American products, and so there are some economic costs. And it also makes people feel less likely to oppose groups like Al-Qaeda that are anti-American, who are not popular to begin with. But if this group is standing up to America and you're feeling angry at America, well, you're not going to criticize them as much. So that gives more latitude for Al-Qaeda. It gives Al-Qaeda more room to move.
It gives those who oppose the United States some legitimacy in their public.
That's right.
Because
That's
of
right.
that
Even if they're not liked. It's like if there are two warlords working in your environment, right? You may not like either one of them, right? But if there's one that's extra strong, and then there's another one you don't like who's not as strong, but he's fighting them, well, it's not that the enemy of your enemy is necessarily your friend, but you don't necessarily want to go against him because there's some benefit for you in him going up against the bigger warlord.
Well, we're in the presidential season, the long presidential season, and I want to talk some about, so what should we do about this? Not what a particular candidate should do about it, but just generally what could be done. And I want to start with one end of the spectrum, which are those who might see these numbers and listen to our conversation and say, oh my gosh, it's hopeless. Let's crawl under a rock. I mean, is despair the response?
Well, in all these numbers, there's some good news, because people are saying, we would really like you to do what you say you're doing. There is a lot of support for the kinds of values that the U.S. has tried to promote. There's a lot of support throughout the world for democracy, for the free market system, for human rights, for a strong UN, all of these things. So the values that the U.S. has tried to promote are pervasive in the world. And so if the U.S. were to be seen as realigning itself with those principles, and above all, being willing to accept constraints within that kind of system, I think this could shift rather quickly. It shifted in a negative direction rather quickly, and I think it could shift it back in a positive direction rather quickly. The number one question is the U.S. going to pursue its interests in a kind of unilateral, unequivocal way? If we can get away with it, we're going to do it, or we're going to play by the rules. There's some reciprocity. One key example is how we deal with the situation in Iraq. The people in Iraq think that we, even if they asked us to leave, we would not leave, that we plan to stay there permanently, and that's a perception throughout the region that's of great concern. So one key message that the President of the United States could give is a very clear signal that that this is a reciprocal relationship, and that if the Iraqi government wants the U.S. to leave, it will leave. That we are not simply there as an imperial power trying to expand our footprint into the region, which is the way many people do perceive it.
So let's go to the other side. So what can we do in a more proactive way? I'm not suggesting from either a Democratic perspective or Republican perspective, but from the perspective of, look, here's the data, here's the dynamics that are working against us. What are some of the policies that would work for us? You mentioned in Iraq, coming out unequivocally and saying we're not having bases would begin to make a dent. What are some other general approaches that you think would begin to appeal, reverse some of the trends? Well,
it's a theme. It's a theme of restraint. And one other example is around climate change. There's a lot of anger at the United States right now because it produces so much of the climate-changing gases, and yet it hasn't made any commitment to limit its emissions, has not signed the Kyoto Treaty. And we were surprised actually to find out how big a factor that was in negative feelings toward the U.S. There's a kind of perception that the U.S. is taking a lot of resources, absorbing them, creating a lot of emissions, and yet and not acting responsibly in the international environment. That it's just pursuing its interests unequivocally, and so that's one more area of restraint. Another area is the treatment of terrorism suspects. It's like now that the U.S. has these concerns about terrorism, the perception is, all the restraints that it tried to teach people all these years, they're out the window. But if the U.S. were to show more restraint in that regard, and then it comes around to respect. Respect not only for these terrorism suspects, but in the way the U.S. communicates and deals with other countries, that to see them as having a kind of a valid position and not simply plowing forward, and that is a theme, and that's something there's a lot of emphasis now on communications. I don't think communications is the complete answer by any means. We just have to explain ourselves better to people. But I think there are things that we can do in terms of communications where we emphasize respect and reciprocity that could make a difference.
Well. Restraint, it traditionally in U.S. politics, restraint coming from the international side on the U.S. is seen as a bugaboo. We don't want to be part of the UN, and we don't want to accept the Kyoto Protocol because it would put restraints on us. And now with the whole national security focus, people saying, well, but we don't want to be restrained in going after national security. So is that in terms of what U.S. opinion? Is that a real restraint on what leadership can do on some of these issues like climate change?
Yeah, there are a lot of myths about the American public, and one of them is that they don't like the UN. They actually very much like the UN. They would like to see a more powerful UN. They even support the idea of having a standing UN peacekeeping force. So, and they think that one of the key lessons of 9/11, 80%. In a Chicago Council poll said that the key lesson of 9/11 is that we need to work together with other countries more, not that we need to be willing to act on our own more. So you find that when we're talking also about Kyoto, there's very strong support for addressing the problem of climate change, a readiness to accept higher energy costs. They're even ready to accept taxes on energy if the revenues were assigned, directed to dealing with these kinds of environmental issues specifically. So there are no indications that the American public is some kind of obstacle to taking the steps that would bring the U.S. into a more harmonious relationship with the rest of the world.
We have just about 30 seconds left, Stephen, and I'm wondering if people want to know more about this, to track opinion polling as we go forward, how can they do that? What advice would you give them?
Right. Well, we have a website called worldpublicopinion.org, and we gather together the polls from all kinds of sources, as well as polls that we're doing as part of the worldpublicopinion.org network, which is a network of research centers around the world in 24 countries now that we're doing coordinated polling. So if you go to worldpublicopinion.org, you can find out quite a lot of information about what people in the world are thinking, and I think you'll generally find it rather encouraging. It's really quite remarkable how much people all around the world agree about what needs to be done, and they express a lot of readiness to take action, working together to address those problems.
Well, Dr. Stephen Kull, Program on International Policy Attitudes, University of Maryland, thank you very much for being here, and thank you to our viewers, and we'll see you next week on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.